All right, welcome back. This will be the final lecture on the chapter on labor supply. So you know the drill by now, so let's jump right back in and get started. So we use the concept of elasticity in economics. Elasticity is basically just the responsiveness in one variable to the change in another variable. So in this case, the elasticity of labor supply measures the responsiveness in hours worked to changes in the wage rate. So if something is elastic, we say that it's responsive to a change. And if it's inelastic, then it's not responsive to a change. So looking at the elasticity of hours worked compared to changes in the wage rate, we can write this as an equation. So we can do that using the percent change in hours worked, so percent delta H, divided by the percent change in wages, or percent delta W. When the labor supply elasticity is less than 1, the labor supply is said to be inelastic. When this happens, the hours worked respond less than the wages in percentage terms. On the other hand, if the labor supply elasticity is greater than 1, then we call it elastic. So the hours worked will respond even more than the changes in wages. Now, your textbook walks through a good example of women's labor force participation in section 2.9. It considers household or the household as the economic unit, with a husband and wife choosing to specialize and allocate time towards the household and to the labor market. Provides a good analysis of the budget lines for both members and their utility function. And although we won't have enough time to have a full discussion here, I do recommend you reading it and working through the implications on your own. That I think will be a helpful exercise. I'll prepare you for some of the assignments that we'll be doing this week. So now let's work through the second example provided by the textbook. This one is in section 2.11. There's been a long debate on whether welfare programs impact individuals' decisions to work or not. So let's look through our very simple model using the neoclassical labor leisure decision model and see what implications we can get from that. So let's start with a simple example. So for this one, the government begins a program where they provide a $500 cash grant each week to an individual who's not in the labor force. So they can't be employed and they can't be actively looking for a job. So in this example, the U0 utility curve represents the utility curve for when an individual does not receive a grant. So you can say this is before the program begins, or if they decide not to leave the labor force to receive the grant. The initial budget line is the line FE that comes down here diagonally, and is based on whether the indifference curve, or where the indifference curve is tangent to this budget line, will determine where they're willing to work. So in this case, it's point P, where U0 is tangent to that line. In this case, they'll prefer 70 hours of leisure per week, which for this example corresponds to 40 hours of labor because there's 110 total hours that they're considering. Now, once the cash grant program goes into effect, if the individual opts in to receive that cash grant, this changes the choices available for the individual. So in the past, they could not have moved beyond the utility curve U0. That was the best that they could do at this tangent point P. But now they can receive the $500, which allows them to move out to point G. So right here is the $500 that they can receive. So we draw a straight line out from here. It can go as far out to the 110 hours of leisure, but it can go no farther than that because that's how many hours there are in the week. In this case, I think they're excluding time to sleep each night. So they can go all the way out to this utility curve U1 at point G. Now, why doesn't this look like an increase in non-labor income, which just moves the endowment point up? In the past, we would have the endowment point here up to G at that $500, and then a line going up parallel to EF. Well, the reason why we don't have that in this case is that the individual here can either choose to receive the grant and not work, or they can work. So for this case, they're going to end up being two separate lines. We'll see the next example where they are able to work and receive the grant, in which case it will have the normal line that we've seen in the past. But in this case, it is one or the other. So that's why they're separated here. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, But what does this model show us will be the result of this program? In this case, using this very simple analysis, this individual will choose to exit the labor force and to remain outside of it in order to receive the $500 grant. For them, they can maximize their utility here at point G. Again, we're farther out than the original utility curve here at U0. That's what maximizes their utility. So $500 of consumption, which is what they receive for that grant, and then 110 hours of leisure, the full week of leisure. Working at the available wage rate is not going to provide enough utility to be a better option than dropping a labor force and receiving that grant. Now, of course, in practice, this may not always be the case. The individual might be thinking about the future, knowing that maybe this is better in the short term, but longer term, they'll be able to get some raises, maybe use that experience to find a new job. So it'll end up being worth it in the long run, even if it isn't today. I do a lot of work with labor market regulations and helping state legislatures craft better, more effective, and less costly regulations. Part of my job is considering negative consequences of policy, so like this case right here, and comparing it to the benefits that they receive. So the work discouraging nature of this policy, in this example here, is undeniable. But if we are trying to, like in my job, trying to work with policymakers to determine what is the optimal policy to do, what is the best form, trying to determine if this specific policy is worth it or not, you have to count both of these costs, which are incredibly important, and the benefits to determine whether or not it's worthwhile. So that's why this type of analysis is very important. Now, because the previous example shows how much that particular style of welfare program can disincentivize work, most modern welfare programs are designed differently, and the goal being to cause as little disruption as possible to the labor market and for the workers or the individual's decision to work. So for instance, in many states, probably all states, I'm not 100% sure on that, people can still work and receive welfare. But what they do is as they earn more money, their welfare receipts go down. So this removes that strong incentive to avoid work that we saw in the previous example, and it allows people to enter the labor force and to work, gaining skills and experience so that hopefully they can no longer need any assistance. So this example here is very similar to the last one, but it's slightly more complicated. But don't worry, a lot of this stuff is the same, so we'll walk through one piece at a time. So the individual budget line is still FE. In this case, they're earning $10 per hour. It goes from 110 hours of leisure here, if they're not working at all the way up to this point F here, if they choose to engage in no leisure. This is the same slope, same everything as last time. This U0 here is the same original indifference curve, the utility function. And right here at point P, 70 hours of leisure, 40 hours of work is exactly the same as what we saw last time. So now an individual absent this program, so let's say before this goes into effect, they are able to, or if they're maximizing utility, doing point P here, so 70 hours leisure, 40 hours of work, and then engaging in this level of consumption, which is, I don't know, it's not labeled, so somewhere above $500. So now in this case, the individual can work and still receive the $500 grant. So unlike before, where we just had that $500 line out here, now we have a different budget line here. So the individual can get that $500 grant. They can still choose to work at that point, but it has a different slope. Now, the reason it has a different slope, this line HG, instead of being $10 like the first budget line, it's only $5, is because in this case, there is still a tax on someone that they're losing 50 cents of every dollar they earn as part of phasing out that welfare grant. So basically they have a tax rate of 50%. So now the slope is $5 per hour, only half of the $10 in wages that they're able to earn. So on their paycheck, the actual wage rate they receive is $10 per hour, but in reality, they're only keeping $5 because they have that $500 grant that they're losing some of. So it's as if they receive $5 per hour. Okay, so now how does their response to the welfare program compare to the previous example? They're still going to choose the mix that maximizes their utility. In this case, it lies along this curve U1. So here we have point G, or the endowment point, where they have that $500 grant. And then this line all the way up to H is the wages that they would receive. Point R here along this budget line is tangent to this utility curve U1. That's the best that they can possibly do. They're lying along the curve that maximizes their utility. So in this case, at point R, that corresponds to 100 hours of leisure. They're going to be above the $500 grant that they're receiving, but not by too much. And because they're engaging in 100 hours of leisure out of the 110 hours that we're considering in this week, they'll only be working 10 hours. So here we can still see that there's this labor disincentivizing nature of this welfare program. Despite the fact that it's designed to be less disruptive than the previous type of welfare grant, it still is discouraging people finding work. So instead of having people leave the labor force entirely, they're reducing their hours of labor, in this case from 40 hours to 10 hours. So in this example, this is a good way to look at an improvement in the original, or compared to the original type of welfare program. In this case, instead of having people leave the labor market entirely, or the labor force entirely, what they're doing is staying in the labor force and just reducing their hours worked. So they're still gaining this experience and building up skills that later they can use to work full-time jobs and to leave the program entirely. But at the same time, it's still causing this labor market distortion that's discouraging people from working like they would have in the past. Now, this is a simple version of the neoclassical model. We can add different types of income tax schemes, lump sum taxes. We can compare different utility functions. There's a whole lot of other things that we can do. But even with just this little bit of complexity, we can model human decision-making, reach some interesting conclusions, and we can compare different policies. So we can talk very briefly about the earned income tax credit. Basically, the goal of this is to improve even more on the previous type of welfare program that we showed. The goal of the earned income tax credit is to increase the labor force participation rate of non-workers and of specific targeted groups. So the way that it functions, and the goal for how it functions, is to encourage some people who aren't in the labor force to begin working, and to never encourage a worker who is currently working to quit in order to increase how much assistance that they can earn. So I'm not going to go into the full details of this, but we'll look a little bit at how it functions. So here we have the budget line, FE, down to 110 hours. This is the same kind of budget line we dealt with in the last two examples, and it's a straight downward line where they're earning a fixed number of dollars per hour. Say, it was what looks like a little bit more than $10 per hour if they're making 45 a year, but called 15, 20, 25, whatever. It's consistent on this line. Now, how the earned income tax credit functions is by providing a different budget line throughout the level of hours worked and through the income. So instead of being that straight line, we see this kind of curved line here going from E to J to H to G. So it provides a credit increasing the net wages at lower levels of income, like the low segment JE right here. So they end up earning above what their actual wages there because they're receiving this benefit. Suddenly for them, it's more valuable for these low wage positions. So it helps draw people into the labor force. We talked before, and we'll talk a little bit more before the end of this chapter about workers not seeing it as valuable when they're receiving low wages. At that point, leisure is relatively more valuable. This kind of counteracts that effect, helps draw them into the labor force. And then these benefits are slowly phased out over time. So here they're slowly being phased out, and then eventually they get back here at FG once they pass a certain level, that they're back to earning the regular income, and these benefits are totally phased out. So the goal of the program is not to provide assistance that discourages people from working, but to do so in a way that encourages people to enter the labor force, begin working, and then slowly move up over time and not need the program eventually. And that's a main reason why across the political aisle that the earned income tax credit is one of the most popular programs. So we'll end with a brief discussion about the labor supply over the worker's life cycle. So far I have mentioned a couple times about workers in retirement or teenagers, people at different points in their life. but we really only considered a single point in time in our model. And now we want to fully consider how employment decisions change over a worker's life. For instance, workers can trade some leisure today for consumption and then allow themselves to enjoy that leisure later. If you think of this program as a part of your work, part of your job training, then you're doing this right now, sacrificing a lot of time that you could be spent enjoying leisure on doing something related to work. Now, typically, we don't consider education as part of the working decision because, unlike many of you, typically the worker leaves the labor market or significantly reduces their employment to do so. So I think for many of you, when you were an undergrad, you weren't working full time or you're working, just a small part-time job to make some cash while you're in college, but you're not truly, engaging in your career. We tend to say the wages follow an upside down U or a hump-shaped distribution over the worker's life cycle. So they start low, high schoolers or college kids working part-time jobs after school, and then entry-level workers receiving low wages. Over time, these workers get promoted and they develop human capital, end up resulting in increased earnings. These increased earnings tend to stabilize by about 50 or so, and eventually they begin to decline as many workers cut back their hours and begin to retire or work part-time. So here we can see this graphically, so you don't have to just imagine it. On the left here, we have the earnings shown as the wage rate across the worker's life cycle. Now, the second one here shows something a little bit different. It's the hours of work across the life cycle. Now, this is going to be slightly different. You see, it's not quite as low here in the early years like the wage rate is, but it follows the same basic pattern. What's important to note here is that the price of leisure, or what the individual is giving up to enjoy an hour of leisure, is relatively less costly for both younger workers down here and for older workers over there. In this case, it's because their lower wages mean that they're giving up less for leisure. And the highest wages come in the middle, right here, at this point in their life. These middle-aged workers are working the most, and honestly, leisure is relatively more costly because of their higher earnings potential and their wage rates, and because of, thinking for the future of not wanting to work when they're 60, 70, 80, 90, going through the rest of their life. So what we tend to see is these middle-aged workers working the most and sacrificing their leisure time at this point so they could spend more time on leisure later. We call this the intertemporal substitution hypothesis. I know, difficult words, basically saying that over time, so intertemporal means over time, so over a person's life cycle, they substitute their leisure in order to take advantages of the price. So it's relatively more cheap here for leisure, relatively more cheap here, relatively more expensive here. So they're going to substitute over time, engaging in more leisure down here when it's cheaper, working when it's relatively more expensive to engage in leisure, and then again, engaging in more leisure where it's relatively cheaper. But while the general trend is the same across workers, workers that earn different wages will experience different levels of changes throughout their life cycle. So here we have an example of two different workers earning very different wages. Out here, Joe out-earns Jack with a much higher wage rate. But if we go over to the hours of work, we're not exactly sure what this is going to mean for how many hours Joe chooses to work. So if the substitution effect dominates, Joe is going to end up working quite a bit more because Joe can earn a lot more money. It's relatively more expensive for him to engage in leisure, so he does that. On the other hand, Joe might work a lot less if the income effect dominates. In this case, he's going to work fewer hours because leisure is a normal good, so he can now engage in more consumption just because of the increase in wages that he's getting, and he can allocate more time towards leisure as well. Now, the life cycle earnings pattern doesn't only affect the hours worked, it also affects the decision to work or not. So we can see the same pattern emerging for the labor force participation rate over the lifetime. So people are young, down here in high school and college, they're much less likely to work. And you see the same thing happening as they get older. They begin to retire and exit the labor force. For these people, both the young and the relatively old, leisure is less costly in this period in their life. So they're far more willing to leave the labor force to engage in that leisure. But prime age workers, up here, we're talking 25 to 55, are much more likely to participate in the labor force. Now, this brings us to the end of chapter 2. There's some discussion in your textbook about testing whether the models we use that we've talked about so far hold up with empirical evidence. I'm going to skip that part, and that's not necessary for you to read because there's quite a bit of empirical work that we're not going to be working with. I don't want you to take away, learning about regressions and fixed effects models and things like that. That's totally unnecessary for what this course is meant to do for you. There are a few smaller topics and examples in the text that I didn't cover in this lecture. I do encourage you to read those, as they're going to help with your understanding of concepts and with the assignments. With that, I'll be ending the lecture for chapter 2. If you have any questions as you're working through the assignments, again, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to help.